Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey, and on this episode, I'm joined by Gerard Leider and Ed Hauder. Gerard and Ed are both working out of our Lake Forest office. And Gerard, Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Ryan. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, great to have you guys this morning. So we're going to talk about retirement today, and retirement of an executive is a pivotal transition for any company. Every company wants to retain key executive talent, but at the end of a career, they also want to ensure a fair transition out of the company with the least amount of disruption. And the treatment of equity awards upon retirement is an issue that many companies rarely consider. Yet the retirement of a key executive as it approaches can quickly gain importance. So today we want to discuss the key questions every compensation committee should be asking about their equity retirement provisions. Proactively addressing these questions can help avoid the potential pitfalls with executive transitions. So Gerard, I want to start with you, and maybe we could just kind of start with some general kind of thinking about the topic itself. So why is equity treatment such a critical issue to consider when we're thinking about promoting smooth transitions for executives?
Well, Ryan, let's start with the basics. Equity compensation. Now, long-term incentive performance plans typically are between 50 and 75% of a public company's executive's annual target opportunity. By nature, this is long-term performance-based pay. It vests and has performance conditions that are long-term in nature. So I think the idea of how you treat that upon retirement will influence important decisions around transition, succession planning, proactive mentoring of successors, and so forth. If this doesn't take place, and the treatment of equity is not clear, in my experience, that leads to poor or sometimes no dialogue around the retirement timeline. And that puts the board in a problematic area when it comes to retirement and executive transition. Additionally, if retirement is not defined or thought about in a proactive fashion, in my experience, it leads to inconsistent treatments across the executive team and a lot of special negotiations, case by case. Those individual negotiations and exits, most time are emotional and leads to some difficult decision making. So being proactive and having definitions around what retirement looks like and how equity is going to be treated, just is a better situation for both board and the executives themselves.
Yep. No, definitely agree. And as you mentioned, the LTI component it is such a large component of pay, and it's really the one component that has that long tail that has to be addressed, that vesting or performance tail that has to be addressed if somebody's leaving. So interested to get into kind of the nuances and the details here. So Ed, maybe we'll get to kind of the core question, because I think we teed this up as being, what are the things that committees should be asking themselves, should be asking the management team as they think through this issue of equity retirement treatment. So what's the kind of the short list of key questions that you'd suggest committees should be thinking about?
Ryan, I think there's probably 4 or 5 questions committee members should be asking themselves when it comes to retirement treatment. So first, what is our current retirement treatment, and how does it compare to both the current and developing market practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll help inform where we are versus where the market's going, and if there's any divergence, if we have to make course corrections. Next, how are we defining retirement versus how should we be defining retirement? There could be theoretically a difference there, particularly depending on what your strategy is for the attraction of new talent, right? If you're going after sort of mid-career or late career folks, having a retirement definition that is more traditional, let's say 65 and 10 years, might be problematic. So thinking through that, I think, would be helpful. Next, another question would be, what happens to equity upon retirement, and how should different equity vehicles like restricted stock units, RSUs, stock options, and performance share units be treated? Figuring out what everyone believes is the right treatment, I think, will be helpful. And again, comparing that to what the market practice is to figure out where you want to differentiate yourselves against that practice. And then I think one other question would be, have we coordinated our retirement treatment for equity awards with other provisions in both our retirement plans and in our severance arrangements, because it really would do us a disservice if our definition of retirement for purposes of the equity awards could cause issues under those two types of arrangements.
Yeah.
So I think those are probably the key questions to ask.
Yeah, no, it's a solid list, and I think one that I'd love to kind of tick through each of those and dive into a little more detail. So Gerard, maybe we'll start with the first one, and I think this kind of gets a little bit at a blind spot for many committees where you can ignore this issue of retirement. It can kind of work behind the scenes without causing a lot of issues, and until all of a sudden one of your senior executives is retiring and maybe the transition doesn't go smoothly. So I guess let's address that first question just around, should companies be defining retirement treatment? What does that look like? And in your experience, how common is it? Are most companies, trying to spell this out in a clear way, or are you seeing a lot of companies that have this blind spot where they really haven't addressed the topic the way they should?
Yeah. So again, I think the blind spot may be a little bit broader, and I'm going to start with programs need to work in harmony. And what I mean by that is you can define retirement to be aligned with market practice and what you want to think is appropriate for your company. But how does the equity be treated at retirement also needs to work in harmony. So, the blind spot is not looking how the overlap works. So what do I mean by that? If you define retirement in an organization, simplest terms or easy to attain, for example, flat age at 55, maybe you should think about how you treat that equity. Is it extremely generous? Do you accelerate it all? Probably not. You probably be more on the prorated side. We'll talk about the specifics here in a little bit later. But specifically, we need to be in harmony as how we define retirement, how we treat that equity. So as a result, it is majority practice for most organizations to have a pre-established retirement definition and to be clear around what happens upon that equity. And that has become the majority cases. One thing that we are going to see a little bit, maybe talk a little bit later today, is most equity plans go beyond the executive team. So the basic definition of retirement and treatment of equity applies outside the executive suite. And what you will find in some situations is what I refer to as a good leaver policy that overlaps the basic program. So as an organization thinks about retirement and treatment of equity, that applies across the organization, all equity participants go beyond the executive suite. In addition to that, you may find the opportunity to put in a good leaver policy, which is additional policy that further encourages the appropriate behaviors upon retirement in exchange for maybe a notice period or a successful transition of your role. You may find a sweetener that comes into play as part of that retirement definition. But again, majority practice, define retirement. Remember that the retirement definition and treatment of equity applies to the broad equity participants in most situations.
Yeah. One quick follow-up there. So, this is an item, this general topic of retirement treatment that's you're not going to typically be on the annual agenda for a committee. When and kind of how often? Like, is this something that every certain number of years you'd suggest the committee kind of revisit, or is it part of the succession planning process? Like, when would you suggest the committee consider looking at this in more depth?
Well, I think first off, committee members should be reminded of what it is annually. So what I found is you don't necessarily put a long award agreement in front of them that it defines it, but a short term sheet that has the key design features specific to the equity grants and how you treat your options versus your restricted shares versus your performance plans. There may be some variations there, but again, reminding the committee what that treatment is annually as part of a term sheet when they approve the equity awards. But when organizations are going through significant transition, maybe significant divestitures or acquisitions of talent or large succession planning discussions, for example, if you go to the outside market and bring in a very seasoned individual who's far along in their career, who may automatically qualify on the age side of things, you need to make sure you understand how you align those equity awards up. But on a frequent basis, it's good to kind of reassess those equity treatments, and this goes beyond just the retirement piece, to be specific. So every couple of years there should be a natural review, I think, of those terms and conditions.
And
Makes
Gerard,
sense.
Gerard, I think there's a couple of natural inflection points where committees could just take a look at what the retirement definition is and how equity is treated. For once, on an annual basis, you've got the proxy where you've got to put together the termination tables for your top executives, at least. So that's a chance to review that, treatment there. And then in the natural order of things, you've got an equity plan, and most equity plans are probably coming up for renewal every 3 to 5 years. So when that comes up, you can talk about the retirement definition, assuming you have it in the plan or in the associated award agreements, which would have to get reapproved.
Yep. Yeah, no, those are two very natural touch points to take a look at that. So maybe Ed, let's transition to the second question that you outlined, which is around the definition itself. So how do we define retirement? Maybe if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, just common practices, what do we typically see in the marketplace, but then also what are some particular issues within a company, talent related considerations, other things that might drive you to a particular retirement definition?
Right. Now, I mean, I think there's this notion when we think of retirement, oh, I'm going to hit age 67. I'm going to qualify for retirement under Social Security. I'm there. Well, age only is a minority practice for definition of retirement. It's a significant minority practice. So we're not going to spend much time with it other than to say, when we see it, the majority practice, believe it or not, is to make the age between 50 and 55, which frankly is very low given where, the market is today and how, later career executives are moving from one firm to another and bringing their experience. Another way we've seen this done and defined was years of service. And so if it's just years of service, again, probably the typical place you might look for this is, the military, right? 20 years of service and you would qualify for retirement. But in the business world, that doesn't quite work out. Again, because of some, mid-career or late career hires, that definition may not be enough. You may not, if you have that as your definition, you're not going to be able to attract the people you might need. So what I think companies have sort of gone to is this combination of a minimum age and a years of service, number. Now, some express it sort of as a minimum age of 55 and minimum years of service of 5 years. That was sort of 5 or 10 years was sort of, I would say, current market practice. I think we have to think about why is that the case? And I think when we look at retirement, we can see that the definition for equity plans sort of came over from pension plans. And those were heavily influenced, heavily influenced by unions and heavy industry. And the definition of 55 and 10 made sense. But in today's market, what we're seeing is a change away from 55 and 10 or 55 and 5 to something like 60 and 5 or less desirable 60 and 10. So if you're trying to get a late career hire, having 60 and 5 might be enough that, okay, someone can come in at age 60, work 5 years, and still then qualify for retirement treatment for their equity awards. So you're then able to get someone in the door. Whereas if you use 60 and 10, then if you got them at 60, they've got to stay there till 70. In this, environment, that might be a difficult sell. So keeping it, I think at 60 and 5 is probably a better a way of defining this going forward. And that's what we're seeing in the market as sort of the emerging practice.
Yep. So a follow-up question that I think maybe some of the listeners might be thinking is, do you ever see differences? So, I mean, is it same definition for the entire team, or do you ever do one-off contracts where somebody's got their own special retirement definition?
If you see one-off contracts, it's more likely than not going to be directed to the CEO or some of the top C-suite executives who have critical talent that's necessary for the business. And they're likely later career stage. You need them and you're willing to sort of deviate from what your standard definition is. But I think going back to what Gerard said, I think most companies try to have a standard definition that applies to everyone. And it's more than just the top of the house folks that definition would apply to. It would be anyone that receives equity. So I think that's an important distinction here.
Yep. Yep. No, I would agree. And it is anytime you start doing one-off things, it becomes a very slippery slope. So I think it's a nice lever for the committee to have to just say, hey, no, this is our definition. It makes sense strategically and we apply it to everybody. But So we've established, makes sense for committees to be looking at this topic. It makes sense for them to be defining and spelling out these retirement provisions. We just established, what is retirement? How do you define that? So Gerard, maybe we can go to the kind of the next big key issue is, okay, so retirement's happening. Now, how are we going to actually treat those equity vehicles? And of course, there's a lot of different things, different ways you can design equity treatment, from options to PSUs and whatnot. So maybe walk us through, kind of typical market practices, but also some of the strategic nuances we should think about to ensure we've got a nice, smooth retirement transition.
Happy to, Ryan. So three basic vehicles when you think about long-term incentives. And I think we're going to focus on annual opportunities. And at the end here, I want to talk a little bit about, would you go outside of the norms? And we talked a little bit earlier in our prior comment around special situations. I think we need to think about that when you start making equity grants for special situations. So prominent practice when you grant annual equity, when you look at stock options, is typically upon retirement, unvested shares would forfeit. But there's a second mechanism around the options, which is how long do I have to exercise my vested options? In this case, majority practice is full term. Note, you'll see some variations by industry, but my comments are focused broad market comparison. So think about organizations that have maybe a little heavier weighting on options, or maybe 100% options, which is minority practice. But in the tech sector, as an example, you may find some different treatments here that go a little bit differently. When you move into time-based restricted stock, the practice is really split. About a third of companies will forfeit, a third will prorate, and a third will accelerate. Note that the design features around restricted stock may influence this, meaning that if you have a 3-year cliff versus 3-year graded as part of the annual grant, that may be influencing the treatment of that equity. But again, we're seeing that balance in play there. Think about where restricted stock has come over the last couple of years relative to the weighting of time-based RSUs in the arena of executives as it relates to specific equity vehicles. So that's just a consideration. The big piece that seems to get a lot of attention is performance shares, performance cash plans. Here, prominent practice is a pro rata payout, but again, at the end of the performance period based on actual results. We are starting to see about 20% of the market allow continued vesting. And there's some difficulties there that we need to just think about. But again, that's another balance to think about. Again, in my opening comment, I think it's important to think about the type of equity award you're giving and the reasons why. So the treatment of retirement we just discussed was related to annual grants. When you think about out-of-cycle special grants, retention grants, succession planning grants, turnaround performance grants, this is where you may want to rethink that retirement definition in the award agreement and customize it to the purpose of the award. So, for example, I grant a special equity grant to a CEO relative to a 3-year turnaround plan. He may be retirement eligible. Last thing you'd want him to do would be walking away mid-cycle with that award. So as a result, you may actually eliminate or modify that retirement definition, that award agreement, to accomplish the purpose of that special award. So I think the takeaway here is annual structure, broad-based equity grants, consistency in their design and treatment of retirement. And if you need to customize it, you have that ability to do that based on those individual awards, based on the purpose of what you're trying to achieve in their design.
Yeah, no, good, great overview of practices there. And I think that the one kind of theme I'm hearing throughout that market data, if you think about kind of the middle of the market practice, is that companies are essentially trying to keep people whole. They're not, you don't want to make retirement overly attractive where people are kind of motivated to retire earlier and basically be better off than the rest of the executives that are sticking around. And at the same time, you don't want to penalize them. You kind of want them to be generally neutral to the retirement situation, is what most companies at least are driving for. But there are some unique circumstances, like you said, where you might succession planning, you might not want them to retire. You might want to maybe exclude something from the definition.
Yeah, I think the objective here is, what we have found is organizations that have predefined retirement definitions, clearly articulated the treatment of equity, that encourages the right behavior and relationship between the committee and board and that executive to proactively manage that to the benefit of the organization and the committee. At the end of the day, when you don't have those definitions, again, you're negotiating and you actually probably putting the benefit in the executive's hands versus the organization's hands to actually find that right balance.
Yep. Yep. So I think we're down to the fourth and last question, Ed, that you had outlined, and it's a bit of an overarching question, which is just, what else should we be thinking about? We've really focused on retirement treatment of equity because it is such a big component of pay, but there's other things that we need to make sure that we're coordinated with, other things that are going to be affected by an executive retiring. So what are some of the other things that committees should be asking and making sure are properly dealt with from a retirement perspective?
Yeah, I think there's three main things, companies should try and keep in mind here. One, I think they should try and make sure that the retirement definition and treatment doesn't trigger severance in retirement. So you have to have coordination between the two. Another is you have to have coordination of the definitions of retirement plans and also in deferral arrangements. Because if what someone does qualifies as a retirement under the equity plan, but not the other two plans, that could present a problem. So I think looking to make sure, is this the right definition first? And second, should we have it standardized across all our plans? There may be reasons companies decide not to have it standardized, and that's fine, but just acknowledge that and ask that question, I think would be helpful. And then finally, this notion Gerard already mentioned was good lever, right? And so what that really means is what you can do is you can set up what happens upon, someone becoming retirement eligible. And when we come to this, there's a potential issue, right? If someone is retirement eligible and that's all they have to do is say, I'm retiring and I get this treatment, you could have an accounting issue here, right? Because as soon as someone becomes a retirement eligible under your plan and your award agreement says, we'll accelerate and pay this out or some portion of it, you have to account for that full piece, right? So what you could do is say, look, we want you to give us a notice of 6 months to a year that you're going to retire. If you do that, then you'll get this beneficial acceleration treatment upon retirement. So you work with us, help with the transition. It gives us time to coordinate, find a successor. So that's why I personally like having a notice provision tacked onto the retirement because it lessens surprises. It lets the company know this individual executive wants to retire, and it sets out a timeline. And it also sets out, okay, that now we know 6 months to 12 months, we're going to accelerate the expense over that period of time. So it helps lessen the blow a little bit. So I think those are probably the three main things companies should also take into account.
Oh, go ahead.
Brian, real quick, just a word of caution. In my experience, notice periods are good, but if they get too long, they're problematic. So as you enter into these engagements, think about what it really takes to transition the role. And you get beyond 8 to 12 months, you sometimes run into, I call it sitting duck issues. And so again, I think the notice period is critical because it allows the board, the committee, the team to write the right transition. But as you move into the notice period, just give some long thought about what that looks like. And in some situations, you may need to customize that to the individual because typically these good leaver policies are fairly customized. It's not a one size fits all across the executive team. And to be very clear, the good leaver policies are very selective. This is something that applies to the most senior individuals in the C-suite, would not be broad-based in nature.
Yep. A quick follow-up for Ed or you, Gerard, and you guys may say this is a question that's best posed to legal counsel, but when you get into those notice periods, if particularly if, let's say, the notice period happens and then there's a proxy filing before the actual retirement, is this something that has to be disclosed? I mean, does the company have to say we've been given notice, or is there grounds for keeping that confidential?
It's facts and circumstances. Outside counsel and internal counsel should weigh in on it.
Yeah.
My 2 cents is, I think in most cases, companies that want to, be full and open with their disclosure will put that out there to let people know this individual has given us notice, particularly if they filed, an AK, announcing this. That would make the whole decision easier. If there's been no public disclosure of that, then it becomes a little bit more of an issue to try and figure out.
Yep. Obviously something you always want to check with counsel on, but something to keep in mind. So, Well, this has, I think, been a very valuable conversation. This is, as we talked about, a critical issue that doesn't always get a lot of attention and doesn't necessarily need to be on the agenda all the time, but definitely needs to be addressed periodically. So thanks, guys, for coming out and talking about this today.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Ryan.